Jonathan Engler, Jessica Hockett. Would you introduce yourselves? Jonathan?
Yeah. Well, I started out life in clinical medicine a long time ago. I then moved into drug development, actually, in the industry, and have been involved in sort of healthcare-related commercial, commercial career for most of my life, with a short stint actually as a lawyer. I retrained as a lawyer in my 40s, for these purposes, most relevant of the fact that I co-chair the UK-based Heart Group along with Claire Craig, and I am on the exec committee of PANDA. I have been for some years, which I'm sure your listeners will know as the international group which Nick Hudson chairs, and Jessica jumped on board with PANDA about 6 months ago, and we've been talking a lot ever since and developing ideas together, and in fact just published an article yesterday together, and a few more coming out as well. So that's kind of me.
Jessica?
I'm Jessica Hockett. I'm in the Chicago area. My background is very different. It's in education. I have a PhD in educational psychology from the University of Virginia, and I spent 20 years working in and with schools and other education agencies in North America, South America, doing a lot of teacher training and professional development, written a few books for teachers, have an academic kind of book out there as well about a special kind of school in the United States, academically selective public schools. But I put all that aside when the pandemic declaration hit, stayed home with my kids, ended up homeschooling them for a year, and was also part of the online battle, as it were, against mandates and masking and all those things that were harming kids. Gained a large following on Twitter, have a Substack, and have become known for just pushing back on the narrative and on what's going on, and have taken a special interest in a couple of topics, especially New York City and their spring 2020 mortality event, which has always puzzled me just from the very beginning. What the heck happened there? And I've spent a lot of time gathering a lot of data, submitting a lot of public records requests, just trying to get my head around that. And yeah, happy to connect recently with Jonathan. We found that we were both thinking the same thing, but didn't know each other, or that we were thinking the same thing. So it's been really great to connect from different sides of the world and kind of grapple with the questions that we both keep asking.
Well, bravo and brava to both of you. I really, just as preface, I want to respect that you have done the full route of homeschooling and taking it upon yourself. You know, I think you're just not just walking the walk, you're talking the talk, or whichever way it goes. You're doing both, mm-hmm. And I think that's hugely admirable, because there are so many threats, and we've seen so many threats to our education system, which was effectively abandoned or misused and masked in a huge masquerade. And so for today's talk, I just was thinking of a working topic, and in a sense, it's maybe it's kind of morbidly or a little black humor-ish, but I think basically we're wondering, like, who put the kill in overkill, and the Cambodia was known as the killing fields, again morbidly. What was going on in New York City? Clearly, it wasn't Kalamazoo, Michigan. It wasn't Omaha, and where COVID later played out in the United States, there were vastly different numbers, and we had some similarities in Lombardy region, Italy. What is your take on it? What's been your theory and thesis?
Sure. My theory and thesis has changed a little bit over time, but I think one bottom line for me is that what happened in New York City, whatever that actually was at the end of the day, is not indicative of sudden spread of a novel, deadly pathogen, that what we see there, what we saw there in spring 2020 is so dramatic. It looks more like an earthquake and aftershocks than it does a spread event, just because of how dramatic it actually was. And then as dramatic as the spike was, and maybe we can pull up a picture of that just so people can see, but as dramatic and impressive and shocking as the peak was, the deaths drop back down and then basically go away for the rest of, or the excess mortality goes away for the rest of 2020, as though nothing ever happened. And you might remember this, Randall, that in the news and with Governor Andrew Cuomo, this was pitched as, and is still pitched as, the virus hit New York City harder, but New York City defeated the virus and showed other people how to handle the virus. That is still the myth. And alongside that, over time, there became some revelations about nursing homes and how nursing home residents were handled and dealt with. And so part of the explanation for that spike still to this day is that patients were sent from hospitals, COVID positive patients were sent from hospitals into nursing homes, where they spread the virus to the other nursing home residents and created the mortality that we saw there. But it's interesting when you look at place of death, so that's where people died within the city, and these data are available for any jurisdiction in the United States. That is, did people die at hospitals? Did they die at home? Did they die in care homes? Did they die at other places? Overwhelmingly, really, most death in that period and most excess death occurred in hospitals. And we haven't really heard that much about hospitals, or hospitals have not really gotten a lot of scrutiny. We assume, or it's presumed, that the hospitals were doing everything that they could and everything correctly, whereas the nursing homes weren't. And so the nursing homes have been scapegoated.
Right.
So that's kind of where I entered, I guess, this whole thing was, okay, what actually happened and what can we tell about what happened by looking at where people died?
So I was thinking there was a Steve Martin episode on Saturday Night Live ages ago where he's a surgeon of the time, and he puts leeches on, and as the patient does poorly, the answer tends to be more leeches. That it's somewhat of a circular puzzle that it could, treatment in the days that treatment was not really well documented and so forth. If it didn't succeed, it meant that the treatment hadn't been adequate. And so more leeches is kind of almost a meme level posit. I'm just curious, Jonathan, do you think this was an episode of leeches and then more leeches?
I think there are elements of that within it. Certainly, I believe that hysteria, fear, and panic have played a huge part in causing a lot of the deaths. I mean, we know that ventilation, invasive ventilation, was considered to be a major part of treating what were regarded as COVID patients. And we know they had very bad outcomes. And you can easily see the sort of meme that you just outlined coming into play, where people come in, they're invasively ventilated. Sometimes, I have to say, there is evidence that this was regarded as something that would protect healthcare workers from a dangerous, scary virus. They did very badly, obviously, and they died. And this just reinforces the view within healthcare workers about how scary the actual virus must be. If it's taking out the young, healthy people, it must be really scary. So maybe we need to ventilate even sooner to protect ourselves and to help this patient who we know can really go downhill very quickly. That was the kind of meme as well around it. So yeah, I think there are elements of that within it.
So what's you got to listen to Jessica's lecture at Panda, as did I. What were your major takeaways? What are your criticisms. If you had to take upon her thesis as a devil's advocate, which may or may not be the hat you want to wear, but what are the strengths and weaknesses?
Well, I think the strengths are that, and I'm really talking about my own thesis as well here, so you're asking me to critique my own thesis. But, the strengths are that it really is consistent with Occam's razor in being, if you have a situation where a virus looks like it's accepted now that it's been spreading for months globally in several continents and spreading throughout the world silently, causing absolutely no excess death and no contemporaneous reports of any unusual respiratory infections at all. Although interestingly, a lot of people now saying, "Oh yeah, I had the worst flu I ever had in November 19 or whatever." But the fact is, the medical literature contains nothing supporting that at all, that there's anything unusual going on. So if you have a situation where you've got evidence of spread over many continents for months, and it fails to show up in any signal, and that signal only kicks off when the panic ensues and the emergency is declared, and we saw this happen time and time again, then the Occam's razor default hypothesis there is that it was the consequences of the declaration of the emergency and the things that were changed and done at that time which caused the observations. So that's the strength, and it's a pretty big strength. And I would say that should really be the default hypothesis, which the people who say that there's a complicated story about seasonal triggers and it's spreading silently, nobody noticing, but then suddenly it explodes because we've seen that happen before. I would say the onus is on them to explain what happened. And so that's the strength. The weakness is really that it are the reported direct observations of doctors. So we have these a significant number of doctors saying that they saw patients iller than they'd ever seen, and they had a very different disease to what they'd seen before, and these people were coming in large numbers. That's the weakness. But I do have some comments in relation to that as well. Do you want me to go through those?
Yeah.
I mean, the first point is that these observations were obviously only made in certain locations for this. These death spikes, very, very sharp peaks in death spikes, and number of younger people coming in are only made in certain places. Difficult to explain if it's the same virus. The second point is that this unusual nature of things. I mean, we have seen this before. I mean, if you look into the history of the swine flu epidemic, that was said to be at the time a quite different disease to regular influenza. I think now most people will accept that the clinical picture of an H1N1 infection is indistinguishable from influenza A. So I think often there is a huge, in medicine, in life generally, actually, there is a huge potential for observation and confirmation bias. So this thing, I had an unusual disease. I mean, you've got to appreciate how our mode of thinking has changed. If 5 years ago a series of friends had remarked to each other, "I had that really weird kind of bug over the weekend, left me, washed out for a week or two." The other friend wouldn't then say, "Well, we're under a Department of Defense attack by a biological weapon." They would just say, whereas now apparently such observations are evidence of this. And I like to make an analogy in some senses to the difference between climate and weather. So if you say to people, if you actually say, "I want everybody who has experienced the most extreme weather that they've ever experienced in the last week to put their hands up and post it onto this website, then you will get, because there are a lot of people in the world and there's a lot of variability in the weather, there will be thousands of people who in the last week have experienced the most extreme weather that they have ever experienced in their lives. Mm-hmm. If you just pick out that 1,000 people and write a news report about it, you could easily convince people that is evidence that the climate is changing. But of course it's not. It's just biased data harvesting. Mm-hmm. And pattern and our innate inability to, or I should say innate ability to pick out patterns where there shouldn't be any patterns.
So before yielding the floor to Jessica, I do your weather climate analogy brought up two things in mind. First of all, I ran a medical practice almost 30 years in a kind of a blue collar town near Boston, and one of my nurses kept saying how the world was getting worse and worse and worse. And she was a small town gal. She had grown up, she'd probably now be in her 80s. She kept saying how there were more and more murders. And I said, well, when you were a kid, what was your news source? She's like, I read the, very local town newspaper, and there had been no murders, in this town, very quiet little town. And then, and as she went, to high school and college, she wound up reading the Boston Globe, and then it was, national news, and then it's international news. And she would point out all the things that are happening, a flood in Bangladesh, I don't know, some earthquake in you name it, Japan, whatever, and like one thing after another, and it's like all these people are dying. It's like, well, now you're looking at billions of people instead of the 10,000 people in your town. Mm-hmm. And so there's kind of like a mass effect that we see more and more stuff, and the more stuff comes, and obviously you can hunt this stuff out if you hashtag it and whatnot. And then on a personal note, my worst experience was a tornado. I was literally in my office in 2014 when a tornado, a rare occurrence for Eastern Massachusetts, swept by, the first 131 years. And you could say, well, that's climate, but there hasn't been one since. Anyway, so I did survive a tornado. I'm a tornado survivor.
Are you suffering from long tornado symptoms?
Well, yeah, I mean, many things can be chalked up to that. I lost in ping pong the other day to my wife, and I hate doing that. So I think that probably was PTSD post-tornado stress. I just wasn't really able to attribute it. Anyway, I'm sorry to make that diversion. Jessica, do you want to weigh in on things that Jonathan said, sure, and or address some of the criticisms people have
yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the number, I actually don't get a ton of pushback, but I get silence, which is either better or worse depending on how you look at it. It's like nobody wants to talk about it. What happened in New York City is inside this black box. I often use the metaphor of omerta, which is like the Italian, mafia blood oath of silence. That's sort of what we're receiving. Something that I used to hear more is that the hospitals were overwhelmed. And so I would say to people, well, which hospitals? Let me look them up. Well, it was really just Elmhurst Hospital, the so-called epicenter of the epicenter. So I was like, okay, well, let me ask New York Health and Hospitals for their data. Let me see the occupancy data. And I have the occupancy data. I've posted it in many places. I'm like, okay, here's Elmhurst Hospital. They were not overrun with patients. And in fact, their emergency department data shows that there was a huge drop, and not just there, but all over New York, huge drops everywhere in the number of people coming in. So how do we reconcile this? Then we have the reports, as Jonathan said, from people who say, I was in New York, I was in a hospital, I saw X, Y, and Z. By and large, I have found that those people that are speaking out on social media, or who have, maybe they have a certain following now because they were in New York and they tried X or Y treatment, and so they've become known in the early treatment circles. Those people are people who arrived in New York City sort of after the period of interest. The period of interest for me is really late February to mid-April. And I have been very hard pressed. If anybody listening is this person, please contact me. But I have been very hard pressed to find any employee of a New York City hospital who was in either the ED or the ICU or the COVID ICUs, as they were calling them, continuously in that period. I haven't found anybody, which I think is interesting. We find these travel doctors and nurses who were called in. I'm not sure why that cadre of people was called in, or by whom exactly. That's maybe another rabbit trail. I'm not sure why the field hospitals were set up either. Was this all political? Was this just for show? What was this really in response to? But a lot of these doctors that say that they were there and they say they saw certain things, and I believe that they saw certain things for sure, but they were there mid-April, through the end of May. And even then, I think some of these things that people describe seeing, I think are very easily explained by, even though we don't have all the data that we need yet to substantiate this, they're readily or easily explained by who was being sent into hospitals on the patient side. I believe there was a mass transfer, actually, I shouldn't say mass, systematic transfer of nursing home residents in that key period into hospitals who never left. But the discharge data from New York City hospitals into skilled nursing facilities for 2020, I don't have the time series data, unfortunately, it's not available, but shows a massive drop in 2020 in those discharges of about 15,000, 16,000 people, which is roughly the excess.
When you say discharges from the nursing homes?
Nope, other way around. Discharges from hospitals into skilled nursing facilities. If you look at, I have a chart that's like 4 years of data, like 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20, or something like that. But there was a massive drop in 2020 in those discharges. Right now, I have a FOIA into the Fire Department of New York. They've delayed it several times. Their latest extension is to November. But I want to know the daily number of nursing home residents, care home residents who were transferred into hospitals. I want to see that. There was also, because I guess my point with that is, if I'm a frontline doctor, so to speak, in New York City, and I'm seeing all these sick people coming into the hospitals, and a lot of them are from nursing homes. I may or may not know that, by the way, as the clinician there, and that those people are testing positive. New York City was running 70% positivity on these tests in late March, early April, with thousands and thousands of tests being given a week. It's a myth that they were short on tests in any way. They were not short. They were testing and
they were testing sick people exclusively.
Yeah, right. And so we have this scenario where we can imagine, it's very easy to imagine, where we have people who are sick with all kinds of things. They're on the edge of life, coming into the hospital, and people in the hospital already who are sick and on the edge. They were all tested as well. And then it's positive, and you're like, oh my gosh, this person has this new deadly virus, right? And then you're coming to associate those symptoms or whatever conditions the person has with this.
Thing. So I'm going to interject.
Can I just briefly interject? Because obviously we've not shown any charts or graphs, but I think that sometimes people coming into this cold, they don't appreciate how completely unusual the numbers are. Yeah. For both Northern Italy and New York City, actually, and I think sometimes you can only really appreciate that by looking at a graph.
When you say different from other cities, other localities, or different from their own priors.
Could I, for example, just show you the Bergamo data, for example? Because that's where my sort of interest in this started at the Bergamo. Is it okay if I share?
Yeah, sure thing.
Yeah. So.
I tried to before, but I was having trouble.
While you're doing that, I'm going to just add one thing here. Sure. This is from my article on Donald McNeil in Brownstone. So it's the marvelous Mr. McNeil. Before COVID had actually made had hit ground in New York. This is in February. McNeil had an article and a podcast and video cast in New York City, getting everyone kind of pre-crazy to take on coronavirus, go medieval on it. And so New York City was like already in the throes of panic before this made landfall.
Yeah. By the way, that's an interesting observation, because that article was interesting, because there's another thing I've come to realize recently is, for all that we say, our pandemic preparedness plans never contained any border closures or lockdowns were a brand new thing. It's actually, I think it's wrong, and I think that it is almost a primeval response to the threat of disease is actually to quarantine people, and it goes back centuries. And this is the default response of public health. So it didn't, in retrospect, it doesn't surprise me that people bought into it so easily, and that we apparently, people say, oh, it's really surprising, we had all these plans and we threw them out. Well, plans are plans, fear is fear. And it doesn't surprise me that we reverted back to this medieval.
No, I know. I mean, primeval and medieval, I don't know if they have the same
word.
True.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But they have the evil part, and it's spelled differently, but it is kind of a homophone for evil and medieval and primeval. But I think in the article mentioned some of the medieval approaches to illness back in the Black Death. One of the modalities or the means of transfer of the Black Death was posited to be literally Jews, and so in certain cities like Mainz, Germany. I think that before there was Germany per se, but in the city of Mainz, they were herded into a synagogue, have the doors locked, and the place was burned. And that at least solved one problem for them, but did not get rid of the Black Death. And so to go medieval on something, which is McNeil's, fervent wish and hope, and his kind of what I call his safetyism approach to this is absurd, and And frankly, it was his second go round at pandemic fear. I'm going to, close by talking about my book, Overturning Zika. But he was the principal straw that stirred the drink for Zika and made Zika a worldwide phenomenon with his contact Tom Frieden in the CDC. And I think nobody ever called him out on that until me lately, and I'm just a molecule. But I think he was very much imbued with his own strength from having made Zika into a pandemic and having this come around. And it actually, speaking of climate, it actually kind of coincided with a lot of the climate fears, because they fear in New York City that these tropical illnesses like Zika and Ebola and whatnot are going to, creep up and hit New York City, when in fact the real illness is panic. Yeah, and New York City and a lot of places have done far worse with those. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm ready to add your bit, and I'm going to get back to Jessica in a second.
Okay, so this was an article that I wrote for Panda, and as you can see, 22nd of August, it's exactly 1 year ago. This is the curious thing. I mean, it's starting off with this image here. Can you see the image fine? You can see it okay, can you?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, these are the different regions that make up Lombardy, with Bergamo in the brown color here. But I mean, even at first sight, there, isn't it a bit weird that these death spikes are all completely synchronized across a region, whereas if you think something came in through one or a few people, you would expect to see clustering, and there's no way that these death spikes should actually be synchronized. And in fact, if you look at this is the percent, just looking at Bergamo, which is the most affected, I don't think people realize that what they claiming happened in Bergamo, which I have no reason to doubt it actually happened, but the deaths they are claiming that drove this narrative is, you're talking about on some days there were 10 times or 1,000% excess mortality there. I mean, this is insane. It really is. I mean, so you got in these ripples, you've got the flu, and you've got the the ones that they call a really bad flu season here. And this is what they're saying happened. It doesn't make any sense that is a biological event. And our thinking moved on. And this is actually an interesting graph, because this is the only other time that you can see something like that, other than maybe war. And this is the percent excess deaths for France going back 20 years. And actually, this is 2003. They had a heat wave, and a lot of people died, especially in the big cities, especially in Paris. And it became a bit of a national scandal, because when people looked into it in more detail, of course, today it would just be, oh, it's climate change. Wouldn't it? But there was still some semblance of proper science being conducted then. So they looked into this. They found the very strong relationships between people being basically abandoned by their family for August break, people in the attic flats of large buildings, and people who didn't have access to fans and water died. And it was mainly elderly who died effectively from neglect. And so I just think it's interesting that the only other time recently where you've seen this in a major Western country, it was effectively social care neglect combined with the way that the frail people were treated. And then the article carries on, and it just points out here. This is actually just taken off Twitter. Somebody did this graph, which is the age standardized mortality rates by city, which the ONS have published. Actually, the ONS published a humongously detailed age standardized mortality piece of work, and where you can go through all these cities. And the line here is the effectively Tedros going test, and then the deaths in nearly all these cities apparently are completely synchronized to that. So that was basically Lombardy. What I wanted to show you about Lombardy.
So the last point you're making there with those synchronizations, are they much different in type?
How do you mean?
Well, are they different in magnitude? I mean, the deaths didn't look that different in magnitude per se.
No, I mean, there's New York. I don't think was on there actually, because at the ONS it was all just European cities. Actually, the magnitudes of those deaths in those graphs were not the same as seen in New York. I mean, I don't know if Jessica, you want to show.
Yes, I'm trying to share the screen, but I'm having difficulty doing that.
Okay. So while you're doing that, I'm going to put I'm going to put a little self-promotion here. Just totally off topic, but this is my book, Overturning Zika, and it actually is the pandemic that never was. It has very similar aspects. There's a huge panic, and there were huge numbers of Zika microcephaly cases, presumed microcephaly cases, and they disappeared. There was just a massive overdiagnosis, and then things petered out. We're not going to have time to go into my thing, but I do tell people this usually at the end. I'll spare people at the end if they want to help support my podcast, my video cast. They can buy this book, and it'd be even better if they read it and share it around. But at the very least, if you want to, oops, Jessica has disappeared. Anyway, if you want to help with the video cast functionally, you can buy that book. And I would like people to review it and or suggest people places where it could be reviewed. So while Jessica's reformulating, Jonathan, can you just maybe go over that Tedros bit and maybe some of the other graphs in your story? What's the take-home message from the Bergamo data? What would you want people to learn from it who are not necessarily good with graphs? I think you're on mute.
Apologies, just because of the outside wind noise. I was muting in between speaking. I mean, the take-home message is that the pattern of deaths that you see across northern Italy does not appear to be what you would expect from a spreading pathogen, and it appears to be more congruent with the imposition of an administrative diktat, or a sudden change in policy, procedures, treatment, and so on, because of the simultaneous way it affects all regions. And this is the Tedros thing was just extending that out to many European cities, that we're meant to believe that something spread from one city to another city to another city to another city. But if it did that, it was doing it silently. It wasn't being reflected in either excess deaths or reports of unusual illness, until such time people were told there is a deadly virus virus spreading. Jessica just messaged, I need to be let back in.
Okay, so I think I have Jessica back. Let me see if I can add her. So I apologize for that.
No, it's okay. No, it's not my fault. It was my fault.
Was that clear? What the explanation I just gave Randy?
Yes. Yes, I think reasonably so. I mean, I'm going to just put my own 3, 4, 2 cents, 5 cents in, which is that coronavirus. So I have an article in the Daily Skeptic. Maybe I'll pop up as well. I think there's been a lot of confounding of data based on the coronavirus testing. So people don't always realize that coronavirus has been around as long as humans, sure, if not longer. And coronaviruses constitute if you looked at a textbook from 1999, pre-original SARS, 2003 SARS, you would find amongst the named causes of common cold that coronavirus is number 2. Number 1 is adenovirus. Actually, the real number 1 is unnamed. Number 1 is adenovirus. Number 2 is coronavirus. Then comes influenza B, rhinovirus, etc. A bunch of also rans. And when you start doing coronavirus testing, one would think it's very specific to this version of a coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, as they lyrically labeled it, but that may not be the case, because Omicron is not a genomic strict relative, a lineal descendant of SARS-CoV-2, and that shows up positive. I don't know if the tests were changed along the way to allow Omicron to be positive, but I think there's a bit of a case demic, kind of a blurring, a coincident case finding of people who have illnesses and they show up positive for coronavirus. There's probably a fair number of false positives and blurring, whatnot. And again, coronavirus is a enormously popular common cold. So I think some of that was based on this misapprehension. I mean, if it had been Ebola, and nobody, the baseline population has no Ebola, then presumably when you show it a positive, if you had a good test for Ebola, that would be pretty distinctive and dispositive that this was a case of Ebola. But the fact that we had a baseline population worldwide of people having had coronavirus, I think made this testing somewhat dubious and ambiguous.
100%. I think a great saying I like is, COVID was a disease so deadly you needed a test to find out if you had it, and you needed coercion and mandates to persuade people to have the vaccine against it. I mean, the whole story is frankly a pantomime. Right. Well, except the pantomime is.
So people are going to harsh our mellow, or they're going to basically lambaste people here as conspiracists for not thinking that COVID is real. So before we do that, I'm just going to pop up my. Well, maybe I'll wait on that. But so here's my article that talks about Omicron not really being a lineal SARS descendant. And
I remember that piece. It's a very good piece.
Yeah,
although I would say that you should go further back, and I mean, the working assumption from that piece is that COVID-19, which is in the title there, which you're saying is a disease caused by SARS-CoV-2, you've made an assumption there that SARS-CoV-2 is a novel virus that entered the circulation on top of what was already there. And I'm not convinced that's the case.
Fair enough. I mean, I did this. It is the Daily Skeptic, but I took one skepticism at a time, and so here's the graph of common colds, coronavirus, and so forth. So I guess I got this backwards. Rhinovirus is number one, so adenovirus not. So I misspoke. So people can accuse me of that. Anyway, so Jessica, are you a conspiracy theorist? And is coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 Wuhan flu, is that a real illness? How bad is it as an illness? Jonathan can weigh in. He's a medical doctor, and so tell us, what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think if you, after 3 years, do not have a conspiracy theory of some kind, you're just not paying attention. I mean, it's indisputable that people, our leaders in this mess, conspired, right? I mean, there was planning. Okay, we're going to tell people that the vaccine is safe and effective, even though we don't really have any data. I mean, so pick your conspiracies is what I would say. I do, at this point, I think, go a little further than Jonathan in that I do think that there's evidence that from New York City in particular, and we're not going to get into all of this today, but I think it was staged. I think we had staged sudden spread of a novel, deadly coronavirus. That does not mean that this particular coronavirus does not exist. I think that there are many coronaviruses and many agents out there around us at all times, any of which could be co-opted. That's my term for it. Co-opted, picked. Let's test for this. And I effectively think that that's what happened. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a medical doctor, but my bottom line is if this thing was out there, right, and it's deadly, where would we see it? Where would we see it? This idea that there was silent spread, and actually this was just in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. It's maddening. Holman Jenkins, venerable longtime columnist for the Wall Street Journal, the title of his op-ed is "Do We Understand COVID Yet?" Part 2, and inexplicably he seems to be grappling a little bit, but inexplicably, he says, our early inklings proved correct. COVID's defining feature wasn't lethality, but speed and ease of spread. COVID's threat to the social order, COVID's threat to the social order lay primarily in the number of cases that might hit, okay, so we have a bomb metaphor here, might hit medical providers at the same time. Looking back, the explosions, he says, another bomb, okay? So I think is he looking at the data? I hope so. The explosions in Wuhan, northern Italy, and New York City seem best explained by a virus rampant in populations that had not yet been warned about its existence, and by medical providers accidentally helping to transmit it to the most vulnerable. So there's so many contradictions here. I can't even, but this is where we are right now. The Wall Street Journal in New York City, they can't even reconcile or grapple with the fact of, or even talk about the fact that they had 27,000 extra people die in 11 weeks. 27,000. Where are the bodies? That's where I'm at. Is there a virus? I don't know. I just want to know the names of these extra people. And where are they? Who were they?
And also unusually, and this is covered in the article which we've published, it's gone live today actually, that Jessica and I have written, which is about ethics. I think you'd find it really interesting, Randall. It's about ethical inversions, and we're actually going right back to the Memorial Hospital incident after Hurricane Katrina, and looking at how ethical boundaries are blurred and projecting that forward to see to what extent that may have been responsible for some of the observations in some of the places in 2020. Anyway, the point. I've now completely lost my train of thought. What were we actually?
I was saying, where are the bodies? Who were
Oh
these?
yeah, with age. The point I was going to make with age. Quite right, is age breakdown. So the astonishingly, in New York City, the percentage increase in all-cause mortality between 2019 and 2020 is the same in the 20 to 69-year-old population as it is in the over 70 population. It's about 250%.
Scale of death is like 6 or 7 times 9/11 in like 25 days. And there's not even a recognition by New York City media or the populace, let alone anybody else, that this is the largest mass casualty event in any U.S. city ever. And we
so are you saying they didn't? Are you saying they did not die?
I'm saying it's astounding, and there's no recognition, even how astounding it was, including how many young people died. The number of young people alone is astounding.
Yeah, I mean, the point is that what is claimed to have happened is so completely different
from everywhere else.
What happened elsewhere,
right,
that given that the narrative emerging from New York was used as a central piece of the global propaganda.
Okay. So I think you make your point.
To some extent, it doesn't matter. We need to know what happened, but whether it happened or it didn't happen, what is being claimed became the story.
And maybe a good comparison slide would be to see what happens in other cities when COVID hit. And do you have that as a kind of?
I do. I don't know if I can share my screen. Is it shared? I think you have to switch over to my sharing screen.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Well, right now you have. Yeah. Here we go.
Can you see that? Am I up now?
Yeah. Let me just see if I can. I'm not doing a good job here.
And I won't speak for Jonathan, but I think with what you just said, I question just the idea of spread. Period. This virus from afar, right? And that's why I keep referring to these things lately as staged. Like, of course, the virus isn't from the United States, right? Of course, it's from someplace else, right? And it came over, and then it leaked from a lab, and it transmitted Hollywood plotline style, person to person to person, and strategically created mass casualty events in Iran and Madrid and Northern Italy, but not in Berlin, right? And New York, but not at the same scale of Seattle or Chicago. It's just I think what's happened is, especially with New York, and it's a little bit of the New Yorker mindset, with all due respect, is something doesn't happen unless it happens in New York, and New York has to experience things. And I think I would say that our leaders know this.
If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And if we stage this, if you will, in New York, we can make the whole world believe this. But not if you
I think
stage it in LA. I mean,
yeah, I'm going to drop in my own theory. I'm not sure it's a conspiracy theory, but this is partly observation, partly through Jeffrey Tucker. He made a great observation. He's the head of Brownstone, for whom I write. And he was on a podcast with Dr. Drew, pointed out that Donald Trump's tweets from like March 9th and 10th, once his account had been restored and it was searchable, he noticed that Trump was like, this is a bad cold, bad flu, we're going to soldier on, let's carry on, we have the best medical care, we'll deal with this. And then March 11th, he was, DEFCON 2.
We had the same thing in the UK.
And so Tucker's theory, and we got to lock down. We got to do Tucker's theory, and I guess they looked at records and of whom he had met, and he met the National Defense Council and Dr. Fauci, all stuff in the interim. And so Tucker's conspiracy theory, or his educated guess, is that between March 9th and March 11th, Donald Trump was briefed. And what was said, I think it's his fault that he was unaware of the Diamond Princess. Fauci was. Fauci had talked about it in February, and so forth. But I think what they fed him was that this was a Chinese bioweapon, and that we had to really do, there was going to be massive damage. We were at war, and we had to take on a war footing, and that's Tucker's theory.
Well, I have data to support my theory about those couple weeks, and I've only actually come to this in the past few weeks, and have emailed New York agencies about this, and I haven't gotten any response. But there's data from a few different sources that suggest that New York City hospitals experienced casualty in those last 2 weeks of February and first 2 weeks of March that may have been post-dated and pushed forward. So what I wonder is whether, because you can't activate.
So you think there was ballot harvesting?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Ballot stuffing.
I know, that's a different topic. What I'm trying to tell you, listen, what I'm trying to tell you is, I think that there was death that they're not disclosing, that it actually occurred, and they pushed it forward into the curve. That's what I'm telling you. People.
Right. I'm making an analogy.
I don't care about the ballot stuff. What I'm saying is, in order for Donald Trump or any U.S. president to make the emergency declarations that they made, activate the Stafford Act, mobilize FEMA, they can't do that in anticipation of an emergency. There has to be an emergency they're responding to. So right. Tucker Carlson or anybody needs to ask Donald Trump is, what was the emergency? Right.
Well, I'm agreeing with you. I'm only using the ballot stuffing. It's an unfortunate example because it happened, right. Ballot harvesting happened later in reality. But I'm using it as an example.
That's a way of life here. That's nothing to me.
No, I understand. You're in Chicago, and people get to vote perennially. Even post-mortem.
Early and often.
Yeah, posthumously and so forth. I get that. So I was using an analogy that the numbers are being pushed. I mean, actually, it was always an oddity to me whenever I saw the death rates. If you look day by day by day, the death rates always went down on Saturday and Sunday because the bureaucrats are at home. And then Monday was always the biggest day of mortality wherever you looked worldwide, pretty much in the industrial world. But my getting back to Tucker's guess. And theory, I personally, my own conspiracy theory is that there was a virus, and it was perceived by the CDC and WHO, probably, and China and so forth, and it was Donald Trump, and he was the foreign body that was occupying the body politics were, and there was going to be anything and everything to remove him. And I think a lot of this exaggeration, this kind of war footing was there. To have him err. He had a bubbling, great economy. We look back on it wistfully and hopefully and so forth, and near full employment, blah blah blah. And China was kind of taking it on the chin from tariffs and whatnot, and a lot of his posturing and so forth. And I think there was a confluence of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Dr. Fauci went in and purchased whole cloth or bought into the Chinese. Kind of absurd agitprop propaganda data. People lying on the street with a hazmat suit, help not touching them with a almost literal 10-foot pole, versus the obvious and open sourced Diamond Princess data, where 3,700 people were on board. Serendipitously, not for them per se, but for the rest of the world. We had a perfect experiment, which would have cost hundreds of billions of dollars to replicate if we, had tried after the fact. And so the data were there that there was a flu-like illness, but nothing horrible and nothing, apocalyptic. And I think Fauci purposefully, fed into Donald McNeil, New York Times, so forth, this go medieval on thing, this horrible event and horrible, bad day. And that became the narrative, and it took over the world at a huge, huge cost.
Yeah, that's different from my theory, but I think it works. But all of that, I think, is sort of it's somewhat. I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but for me, where I start from is: did these people actually die on the days that they're purported to have died? Where are the names? In okay. Chicago, I can look up every day.
So I'm glad I isolated that, because when I heard your lecture, I did not understand, your point, and I watched it with JJ Kuig to an extent. So you're saying, so John
Is
Bodwin.
this screen showing? Is my screen showing?
I can do that.
No, because I just want to punctuate. Here's what I think, and with due respect to Americans, I don't know why Americans in particular are so thick in the head about this. They don't. I'm serious. I'm serious. I'm so grateful to be associated with Panda now, because it's like internationals sort of get it better, and I think it's because we are the.
It's the accents. I think they have great accents.
I think it's because the U.S. was a state.
If you say the same thing with an English accent, you sound smarter.
That could be. That could be. And I know I sound crazy, but I don't care, because the urgency of this cannot be overstated. This is deaths in hospitals, hospital inpatient. So you were admitted to the hospital, okay? You're a 20 to 59-year-old. Look at what New York City is saying occurred. They are saying that a bomb went off, and it was called COVID-19, and it killed an incredible number of 20 to 59-year-olds. This happened no place else, not even in Northern Italy. Jonathan, you can correct me.
Correct.
What happened here, and why doesn't the Wall Street Journal, for example, why doesn't anybody want to look at this? Why do I get all kinds of deflections? And well, what about Trump? And what about, forget that.
Okay, so I think it would be helpful if you showed the same thing in other cities and saw the numbers.
I mean,
I have Chicago by comparison. This did not happen at this level.
Okay.
I mean, it is one of the undisputed facts. I think we can surely, Randall, agree on one of the undisputed facts is that there was hardly any mortality worldwide in healthy people under 60.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Israel, I think Israel just came out with a study that said 0 to 49 years of age with no comorbidities, the total, I brought my prop with me, the total number of deaths was zero.
Well, then what happened here? What happened in New York? Look at this. They're all blamed. These.
So how many absolute numbers of deaths were these, and what would that reflect to as a mortality rate for that age group? Well, that's probably too.
Well, no, I have it. I just have to pull it up. I mean, this is 20 to, I have a lot of different, here's 20 to 69 versus age 70 plus week by week. And the reason I chose 20 to 69 here is because the IFRs, I think John Ioannidis just came out, maybe it was last year, with some pretty good, IFRs for under age 70. I mean, basically, if you're under age 70, this is not a thing for you. We can't even, it's not a thing for you. It's just not a thing. But we have, and this is all-cause mortality, but, the increases in all-cause mortality week to week for the under age 70 are astounding. 570% increase. Like, even when I look at these numbers, and again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a virologist. How did they handle the bodies? How did they handle the bodies?
Right. So you're saying that these numbers are factitious and not factual.
I think that they need to be backed up by actual death certificates that actually show that these people died. Listen, in battles, let's just take a page from history. If a battle took place, they produced the lists of the dead. Right. Where are the lists of the dead in New York City? Can they prove this occurred? Because you know what? This whole discussion is sort of moot if we don't even know for sure that these people died. And I have a lot of questions.
So have you FOIA'd?
Yes.
If one can do that, that's the right term.
Yeah. Well, you can't. So again, if I was going to stage sudden spread, I would definitely do it in New York. You know why? Because death certificates are not subject to FOIA in New York, like they are in Illinois, for example, and in other states.
Well,
But what I did is I did submit, and it's been pushed back several times, but I did submit to the medical examiner's office. I was strategic. I said, give me the daily number of death certificates processed. I think I even went all the way back to 2016, but maybe just 2019. I can't remember. So, January 1st, 2019, all the way through the end of 2020. Show me the numbers that you processed each day. I reached out to FEMA. I FOIA'd FEMA and said, hey, what about these morgue trucks that you guys sent to New York City? You know what FEMA said to me? We don't have any records of any FEMA morgue trucks in New York City. I'm like, that's okay. That's interesting. So I've sent a request to the medical examiner's office again. They've pushed it back. But hi, tell me how many bodies you loaded on your trucks every day.
So do you have like metadata points? You have like obituaries, funeral homes?
Well, that's a really good point. So City Journal in New York City, they attempted to document obituaries. They were only able for this spring period for COVID, COVID deaths. They were only able to come up with a couple thousand.
Right, because it's a funny thing, during the George W. Bush era, day by day, we saw news photos of caskets covered in American flags coming off the transport planes from Iraq and Afghanistan and whatnot. And then when Obama became president, those images disappeared. They have a kind of a political tinge. When people want to show things, they show them. When they don't want to show them, they don't show them. And they meaning the probably mistermed media, because it's not necessarily in the median or middle of anything per se, politically, but perhaps as a.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth remembering that there were these on Twitter in this period. There were these accounts of doctors and nurses coming off shift saying, I'm telling you how bad it is, it's apocalyptic, etc. All worded very, very similarly. And now it is suspected that they were all bots. Why would they need to do that? And the same in the UK. We've had evidence that a lot of the young people who were doing ads and appearing on Twitter and various other channels, etc., were crisis actors. I mean, you can pretty much tell it because they don't even look ill.
I have a side question for you, Jonathan. When we say FOIA'd and FEMA, how do those translate to the UK?
Oh, well, we know what you mean because, first of all, I've spent so long talking to Jessica, but also our act is called FOI, Freedom of Information Act. Okay. So we have the same act. We just don't call it FOIA. We just call it FOI. So, okay. But I can translate.
All right, good. So what did Churchill say, that the United States and England are two nations separated by a common language?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, the whole sort of FOIA acts as they've sort of developed worldwide. They don't seem to have resulted in much more transparency than there was before. And
no, I know. Because humans are clever. We're gamers.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I've got a tiny me thing, again, getting back to my Zika hunt. Right now, this is unrelated, so I'll try to make a really quick kernel of it. Right now, they're actually injecting and infecting women in Baltimore, Maryland with the Zika virus to hunt for a Zika vaccine, because Brazil itself turned down like $100 million from us, from the U.S., the NIAID and so forth, to do such an experiment in Brazil, because they're like, we don't have any more Zika-related microcephaly, so thanks, but no thanks. And this would be the impoverished part of northern Brazil where the money would go, and they turned it down. And so the money's kind of burning a hole. It can't be spent unless it's for a Zika vaccine. So Dr. Anna Durbin at Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins has endeavored to take up fill in the void there. And there was an NIH ethics panel in 2017 that said, no human challenge trials. We're not going to inject and infect people with Zika virus. Bad, because of Tuskegee, Guatemala, so forth. We've been burned on this. We're not going to do this. And so I've been hunting this. I had an article in the Washington Examiner a year ago, and I want to have another article on this topic, see what's going on, what's up with that. Because my other different conspiracy theory, which is that there's going to be a Zika vaccine soon enough, and then it's going to be promulgated and promoted and propagated throughout the world, WHO mandated or whatever, for billions of people forever. And after that, they're going to say, oh, we got rid of the problem. Zika microcephaly doesn't exist, where it hadn't existed at all in the interim. So I sent a letter to the FOIA point. I sent a letter asking Johns Hopkins, their IRB, their Institutional Review Board, to show me the documentation that Dr. Durbin presented, so that she could, twist their arm to allow injecting women with Zika. And there's only two possibilities. One is that Zika is dangerous. We should have a vaccine because Zika is dangerous, in which case we shouldn't be injecting women with it. Or Zika is harmless, so we can inject women in it, but there's no point to do it because then there's no point to get a vaccine for something that's harmless. So there's really only 2 points. Both of them would obviate the need to do this experiment. So there's A and B, and they both lead to the same road. And so Johns Hopkins, it's not a FOIA kind of thing because they're a private institution ostensibly, although they're using our money federally. They said no. they said no. That's not something we're going to share with you. Bye bye. So if anybody has any insight about how to,
is there a statutory mechanism for appealing? I mean, presumably the problem is that it starts to cost money if you start to need to litigate.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to leave that out there if any listeners come up with that idea. And I apologize.
You seem so willing to look at the Zika crisis this way, but I sense, and I could be wrong, but I sense that with New York City, you're very willing to come up with a lot of like what I would call magical thinking explanations about that casualty. And so I'm still left with the sense with a lot of Americans, this isn't just a you thing, even within Panda, I'm left with the sense of people want to hand wave New York away, or they want to say, well, remdesivir and ventilators, right? And they don't want to get at the critical question of, was there sudden spread of a novel deadly respiratory pathogen? Could we have been fooled? How easy would have this been to stage? And I say it's absolutely easy to stage, even just with existing patients in the hospital, nursing home residents, and hospice facilities. And never mind what they did with the EMS services, where EMS services in New York were basically told to stand down from cardiac arrest.
You do bring up an interesting question. So, if in fact on an official basis it was seen as not that severe, that might explain the return of the patients from the ICU to the nursing homes. I mean, I don't know if you're catching my drift here.
But I'm telling you, the data say that nursing home residents that there were fewer people discharged to nursing home facilities than any of the previous years. See, all of the data actually contradicts all of these myths that these urban legends that people have been.
Okay, so explain to me. We're going to be rounding out the show soon, but explain to me what. So the myth or the fact or whatever is that Cuomo and other Northeast Democratic governors like Wolf and whatnot, took nursing home patients and took COVID patients of nursing home level health and who survived COVID in the hospital or survived whatever they had in the hospital and had a positive COVID test. They brought them back to the nursing homes rather than some secondary facility just exclusively for COVID. And they kind of super infected, over-infected their nursing home mates, and therefore, the opposite of hilarity ensued. There was tragedy ensued.
Well, I mean, I would say, I don't know if my screen is still showing, but I would say,
I can put it back up.
Okay. I would say, let's look at the data. Let's look at the data. And could the data be fraudulent? Absolutely. But I can only go with what we have, right? So New York City, only 9% of COVID attributed deaths in New York City in the spring 2020 event, 9% occurred at nursing homes. Okay. And there was a lot of non-COVID death in nursing homes. It is very easy, pardon how strong I'm going to say this, it's very easy to kill nursing home residents, right? They're on the edge. They're on the edge. So I can list, I would even say that barring visitors alone increases the mortality risk, right? So
without a doubt.
There's a lot of explanations for what could have happened there. But why? Here's my question to any New Yorker. Why are nursing homes being scapegoated for the clear problem in New York City hospitals?
Okay.
Look at that.
I mean, in nursing home, there are many nursing homes and many people working at nursing homes. So you're not working on the theory that they conspired to murder their clientele.
But are you looking at the data? I just want people to look at the data. Look at the data. The all-cause mortality, the greatest proportion is in hospitals. Most of the COVID deaths were in hospitals. So I legitimately don't understand why people keep pointing to a nursing home policy.
Well, because it's absurd to have taken somebody who is positive and bring it to theoretically a place where, again, if we stipulate
but that's irrelevant. But COVID positivity is not. I guess.
It's not where the deaths happened.
But
it's not where the deaths happened.
Right, it's not where they happened. And why are these myths about COVID transmission and COVID lethality persisting when we know that's not how it happened?
So if you were an alien, you just showed up, or you're Rumpelstiltskin, you wake up, I don't know, from a long sleep, and you haven't seen any of this, and you just were given the data, you would say that people, basically the illness was hospitalitis, that there was something happening in hospitals that caused massive excess deaths, and not elsewhere and not other cities. Or you would say specifically there's something that happened, funkily or strangely in New York City hospital. So the disease is New York City hospitalitis. And then we'd have to parse that. There's a case in the UK, what's her name? Lucy Letby. Are you familiar with that case?
Yep.
First of all, is she guilty? I don't know. She was sentenced.
She was sentenced. Yeah.
Do you think she's guilty?
I'm not going to express an opinion on that because I haven't looked through the evidence.
Okay, well, anyway, basically, there was a case of Lucy Letby. Whether she's guilty or not, there was clearly a case of Letbyitis. That to say that there were 13 people dead over a period of such and such time, and that she's the only coincident factor. She's the only nurse that was present for all of those, and she was, oftentimes the only nurse present at all within the facility at the time of certain of the deaths. And so, again, if you were an alien, you showed up and you looked at the data, you'd say, oh, I don't know if she did it or not, but that's the only common factor. So if we were going to do the Lucy Letby standard of guilt and innocence, what is the Lucy Letby of this hospitalitis thing? What do you think it is? Is it ventilators? Is it conspiracy? Is it factitious data? Is it pumping and priming the what I call, recasting the ballot harvesting of death certificates? I mean, what do you think is the prime suspect here?
I think it could be all of those things. I think it could be all of those things. And I think that I have concerns that these deaths, especially in hospitals, I have concerns that number of deaths did not actually happen in those.
Okay, so now we're talking massive, genuine conspiracy that people have to get together and consign. They have to consign and assign themselves to do this, and they have to join in league and never speak about this again. Who are the people who could perpetrate such a thing? Is it some registrar at the I don't know, Board of Health in New York City? Yeah. Wouldn't there be some kind of trail of a trail of tears, I guess, of an email thread or some kind of conversations, whatever. I mean, who did this? It's very hard to get people, to agree on, 5 people to agree on where to go for brunch. So and yet you're saying that these numbers could be massively, have the tide turned, like the Red Sea parting of data.
So I would say this was actually incredibly easy to pull off. And here's why. First of all, if I'm a doctor in a New York City hospital, do you think a doctor in any hospital anywhere, England too, could tell you how many people die in a month in the hospital? There's no chance. They can't tell you how many people die. They don't know. And they certainly don't know how many people die at Bellevue or Montefiore or anywhere else, right? So I don't think this necessarily requires conspiracy or knowledge on the part of any doctor or nurse. Right, they only have their hand on one part of the elephant. They only see their little part.
I understand, but on a regular day, in 2017, they all have one hand on one piece of the elephant, and you don't have these massive numbers. So where do the numbers come from?
They do and they don't. I mean, you've got to remember that we're talking about aggregating bits of information from lots of different sources, and that are essentially atomized. And you can put together, if you put a large number of very small anomalies together, you get a large number. It's like, for example, if the mRNA vaccines are deadly to the tune of, say, 1 in 1,000 injections. I don't know what the answer is, but say they were, then the chances are that the vast majority of people, nearly everybody, would know maximum only one extra normal person dying.
Right.
The normal, they wouldn't notice it.
I understand that, but still, for this to happen, I mean, we watch the Super Bowl every time.
Do you want to hear? Because I mean, I have an explanation. Like I'm not just speculating.
Okay, because I do want to round this
out.
It's
very easy. It's very easy. Okay, so and you might remember that starting on April 14th, 2020, New York City announced these probable deaths, and between April 14th, 2020, and June 1st, they added around 4,500 probable COVID deaths. Right? You do that in an outbreak.
Okay, but you're saying also the absolute number of deaths was higher.
Let me finish. Okay. Because I want to walk you through how this could happen. So they announced these probable deaths, which probable deaths are a thing in outbreaks. I have an MD sister who worked in Ebola outbreaks, so I know how this works. I know why they do probable deaths in a localized outbreak. Okay. But they added these probable deaths. When were those probable deaths, when they added them, which they've since removed a lot of them, by the way, as COVID deaths, but when were they from? They could have been from even as far back as December. Death certificates do not get processed right away. This real-time death reporting thing is not a thing in the real world. So what New York City was reporting at the time, what Cuomo was reporting at the time for the state were hospital deaths. Okay, he said that later. He said that, and then he got lambasted for not reporting deaths at home. Although deaths at home again take longer to process. So all you would need to do, yes, it does require errors, conspiracy cover up, but really only on the part of a core group of people. It would take state and federal. There has to be fraud at some level there.
Right.
But
there has to be somebody.
Hold on, one more point. The noble lie would have been this: those people who died back here, they probably died from COVID, right? So that's what the inside vital stats people.
I understand, but the absolute number of deaths increased.
So
they need to get some dead people to be those actors.
It's not right, but it's not. So what I'm saying is, I'm not alleging that the deaths didn't occur. What I'm saying is a very real possibility. I mean, you were called ballot harvesting, but the previous deaths were pushed into the curve in some way, even if it's only deaths from the previous week, the prior week to mid-March.
I understand, but you're still talking about tens of thousands extra. And that's the issue. And whether they exist or not.
I'm not saying that accounts for all.
I mean, it'd be interesting to know. John Bodwin of Panda has been looking at death certificates on a granular level in Massachusetts. And I don't know if you've coordinated with him at all, but I don't know if he can lend any expertise on this. Anyway,
I speak to John quite regularly. Yeah.
So I'm going to call it a day. I think it was a very successful show. If you have any last words, Jonathan, Jessica.
No, but you can see there's an awful lot more to say. Maybe we'll come back.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate it. And I'd love to hear thoughts, our viewers and listeners. And you can find Jonathan and Jessica on Twitter. Do you want to give your Twitter handles before we go?
Yeah, I'm JENGLER UK, one word, Jengler UK.
Mm-hmm. And I'm
on Twitter, by the way. Sorry.
I'm Jessica Hockett, but my handle is AE Woodhouse 7 because I used to be under the eponym Emma Woodhouse, and then my Substack is woodhouse76.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Lovely time. I appreciate your thoughts and knowledge and expertise, and thank you for lending them to me and our audience, and I'm in your debt.